Okay, take 5. Hi, my name is Patricia Lopes, and I'm a professor at Chapman University. This seminar will be an introduction to infection avoidance behaviors. So, as you probably know, an infected animal can behave, smell, sound, and look very different from a healthy version of itself. In this example here, the top image is a marine iguana that is parasitized, and we can see a massive ectoparasite above the eye. And this iguana also looks more lethargic, and below we can see a healthier iguana. The same idea is true for changes to contaminated habitats and contaminated food and water sources. There can be visual and odor cues that indicate that there's contamination of those. So in the examples here, we have at the top, we have contaminated a clear water source and a contaminated one. At the bottom, we have a nest on the left that's not parasitized, and then on the right, a goose nest that is parasitized with fleas, and so we see the blood spots on the eggs. And so, given the existence of these cues of infection and of contaminated habitats, an organism's first line of defense against infectious agents is avoiding infection by reducing exposure to those agents. Recent research proposes that many organisms actively try to avoid infection by navigating this landscape of disgust. And so therefore, the physiological immune defenses would be a second line of defense against many infectious agents. Now, the same way that there are costs associated with initiating a robust immune defense that's going to help your body to control and eliminate an infection, so does engaging in infection avoidance behaviors. And we can think of a simple example of an animal that is avoiding a contaminated food source is going to be lose those nutritional resources. And so it has been proposed that the non-consumptive effects of parasites, these avoidance behaviors, these avoidance effects might actually have larger effects than the consumptive effects, similar to the non-consumptive effects of predators. Thinking a little further in terms of costs, so it will be beneficial to hosts in engaging these avoidance strategies when the costs, several costs are reduced. So, for example, the cost of avoidance behaviors themselves. So if avoidance of contaminated food sources is going to lead to starvation, maybe this is not a good idea. But also the cost of infection, so how much morbidity and mortality that particular infection causes, the costs of immune defenses, so the energetic and nutritional costs that are associated with allocating energy into immune defenses. Avoidance behaviors can be categorized into 4 major classes, and they are illustrated here. So we can have avoidance of conspecifics, avoidance of contaminated habitats, avoidance of contaminated food or water sources, and avoidance of parasites or their vectors directly. So an example of avoidance of parasitized conspecifics would be the reduction of allogrooming towards conspecifics that are parasitized with a orofecally transmitted parasite in mandrills. So they allogroom less, they allogroom those infected individuals less. In terms of avoidance of habitats with high density of infectious agents, where we see many examples of this is in species of birds that will avoid nests that are parasitized. This is seen in gray tits and blue tits and cliff swallows. In terms of avoidance of contaminated food, this behavior has been documented more in mammals and more in the context of avoidance of food contaminated with feces. An avian example would be that of oyster catchers. So oyster catchers will prefer the intermediate size cockles, their prey. When most cockles are parasitized, they prefer the intermediate size because it optimizes the amount of energy relative to the amount of parasites that prey contains. And then an example of avoidance of parasites themselves would come from fathead minnows that where it's been shown that they can recognize trematode cercaria and they respond by shoaling more tightly with conspecifics, which reduces parasite exposure. And so this is a clear example of parasite avoidance because it's been shown that the fish behave in this way in the presence of the trematodes themselves. Now, while we can categorize avoidance in those four major categories, other categories are emerging. And one example would be niche modification. So parasite avoidance can also be achieved by the different ways in which animals build or modify their environments. One example of that is the use of aromatic plants by birds. It's been shown that those aromatic plants reduce parasite loads in the nest. So you can see a leaf in this nest on the picture. And then another example of those other forms of avoidance that are emergent would be migratory escape. So it's been suggested that migratory movements and dispersal movements may support avoidance of parasites. And this diagram illustrates 3 different ways in which this can occur, but we don't have a lot of time to discuss this now. When we looked for evidence of each of these types of avoidance behaviors across the main groups of vertebrates, what we found was that avoidance of infected conspecifics and avoidance of contaminated habitats are the most frequent avoidance behaviors seen across most groups of vertebrates. Avoidance of contaminated food sources is not as common, and even more rare is avoidance of contaminated water. And that avoidance of parasites and their vectors also occurs, but in some studies it is hard to disentangle whether animals are avoiding cues from infected conspecifics or cues from the parasites themselves. Also, not much is known for reptiles in most of these categories. So where should we go in the future? As indicated by that table, we really need to do more research on reptiles and understand what's going on there. And then a unifying framework for when these avoidance behaviors are expected to occur is still lacking. And it's been suggested, and we think this is true, that a consideration of the social cost of avoidance might help us get to a unifying framework. Not a lot is known in terms of the physiology that underlies these avoidance behavior in vertebrates. The bulk of the research in this topic has been carried out in rodents, where the neuropeptide oxytocin appears to be a key mediator of avoidance and even of recognition of infected individuals. So it would be interesting to expand this research on oxytocin and its homologs to other classes of vertebrates. And finally, global change. So as climates warm, the decrease in availability of food patches and watering holes may also put individuals in more frequent contacts during times when avoiding conspecifics might have infection-related benefits. And similarly, as food and water become limited during more extended periods of time, the cost of avoiding these resources might become too high. with that, I would like to thank everyone that has attended this talk, and also to highlight all the people that have participated in this chapter. Their names are on this slide. We welcome your questions and suggestions. Thank you.